What if I told you that the financial decisions you're making today could keep you working for the rest of your life? Not because you don't earn enough, but because you're chasing the wrong definition of wealth. And what if the person driving the most expensive car in the parking lot is actually the poorest person there? It sounds extreme, but this is exactly the illusion Morgan Housel warns about in The Psychology of Money, because every day we are surrounded by visible symbols of success, luxury cars, designer clothes, expensive vacations, and social media lives that look perfect, and without realizing it, we start equating what people spend with what they actually have. But wealth is not what you see, wealth is what you don't see, because the expensive watch is visible, but the investment portfolio quietly growing for years is not. The luxury mansion gets attention, but the emergency fund that protects someone during a crisis stays invisible, and the sports car turns heads while the ownership of assets that actually generate freedom remains hidden. And that is the entire trap, because real wealth is not the money you spend, it is the money you keep working for you in silence. And anyone can spend money to look successful, but very few people have the discipline to let money stay invisible long enough to become real wealth. And if you look at two people who get the same promotion and same raise, one immediately upgrades their lifestyle, buys a new car, moves into a bigger apartment, and starts living in a way that signals success to everyone else, while the other continues living the same lifestyle and quietly invests the extra income month after month. And in the beginning, the first person looks more successful, gets more attention, and feels like they are winning, but 5 years later one has expenses, pressure, and obligations while the other has assets, security, and something far more powerful, options, because the difference was never income, it was behavior. And this is where society misleads most people, because it rewards visible spending, it praises consumption, it celebrates appearances, but it rarely rewards the boring discipline of saving and investing, even though those invisible decisions are exactly what create freedom. And ironically, the harder someone tries to look wealthy, the more likely they are to sacrifice actual wealth by spending money that could have compounded into something far greater. And this becomes even more dangerous for entrepreneurs who, after early success, feel pressure to look successful through expensive offices, luxury cars, and lifestyle upgrades that create an illusion of growth while silently draining the business of its stability. Because for a while everything looks impressive on the outside, but behind the scenes cash flow gets tighter and one setback can threaten everything. While the strongest businesses are often built by people who choose discipline over display, who reinvest instead of impress, and who focus on building assets instead of attention. And the uncomfortable truth is that people admire what they can see but ignore what actually creates wealth, which means you are always comparing your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel without seeing their debt, their stress, or their financial reality. And once you realize that, you understand that the most valuable part of wealth has always been invisible. It is the ability to say no, the freedom to make decisions without desperation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your money is working for you even when nobody is watching. And that leads to a deeper question. If real wealth comes from what you don't spend, then what force allows those small invisible decisions to grow into life-changing results over time? What if the biggest reason most people never become wealthy isn't a lack of money, intelligence, or opportunity, but simply the inability to wait long enough for their efforts to actually work? We live in a world obsessed with instant results, where social media makes success look overnight, businesses appear to explode suddenly, and people assume wealth comes from one lucky break. But Morgan Housel explains in The Psychology of Money that the truth is far less exciting and far more powerful. Extraordinary wealth is usually the result of ordinary actions repeated consistently over an extraordinarily long period of time, because compounding is not just about money earning returns on money. It is a force that applies to habits, knowledge, skills, relationships, and decisions, where every small action seems insignificant in the moment but stacks quietly over time until it creates results that look almost unbelievable. Yet the challenge is that compounding is invisible in the beginning, so progress feels slow, boring, and even pointless, which is why most people quit before it starts working, because investing small amounts feels useless at first, building a business feels stagnant in the early months, and learning a skill feels like nothing is changing. But that is exactly the phase where most people fail, because they expect immediate feedback from a system that only rewards patience. And if you look at someone like Warren Buffett, His success is not just about making great investments but about giving those investments decades to compound, meaning his wealth is not just the result of high returns but of extreme patience that allowed those returns to multiply over time, because time turns average decisions into extraordinary outcomes. And this is why comparing your early stage to someone else's decades of consistency is so misleading, because it is like planting a tree and expecting it to look like a forest within weeks, when in reality most of the growth happens underground where you cannot see it, and if you keep digging it up every few weeks to check progress, you destroy the very system that is trying to grow. Yet that is exactly what people do with their careers, investments, and businesses when they constantly switch strategies, abandon plans too early, or chase new trends every time they feel impatient, and in doing so they restart the compounding process again and again without ever letting it build momentum, when in reality compounding rewards those who can tolerate boredom, because building wealth is often repetitive, slow, and unexciting in the short term but extremely powerful in the long term. Which means the real challenge is not understanding compounding but trusting it during the invisible phase when nothing seems to be happening. Because every day you stay consistent while others quit, every month you remain disciplined while others restart, and every year you let time work while others chase shortcuts, your advantage quietly multiplies, and although it will never feel dramatic in the moment, over time it becomes unstoppable, and that leads to a deeper question. If patience is so powerful that it can transform ordinary actions into extraordinary outcomes, then why do equally hardworking people still end up with completely different lives? What if I told you that two people can make the exact same decision, work just as hard, think just as smart, and still end up with completely different financial outcomes? Most people don't like that idea because it challenges the belief that success is fully under control, but Morgan Housel argues that this is one of the most important truths in money and life. Every outcome is shaped by two invisible forces, luck and risk. And once you understand that, it changes everything, because you stop assuming success is always earned and you stop assuming failure is always deserved. Think about two entrepreneurs who are both skilled, both disciplined, both working long hours, and both making smart decisions, yet one launches at exactly the right moment when demand is rising and investors are active, and the business explodes, while the other launches just a few months earlier or later and gets hit by a recession, supply chain issues, or a sudden market shift. Same effort, same intelligence, completely different outcomes, which raises a difficult question. Was success really created, or was it supported by timing and circumstances no one controlled? This is where most people misunderstand reality, because we look at successful people and reverse engineer their story as if it was inevitable, assuming they succeeded purely because they made better decisions, while ignoring the thousands of similar people who made similar decisions but still failed quietly, not because they were worse, but because luck didn't show up in their favor or risk showed up at the wrong time. The danger starts when things go well, because success begins to feel like proof of genius, and that confidence slowly turns into overconfidence, which then pushes people to take bigger risks until one day the same randomness that helped them can also hurt them. But the opposite is just as damaging, because when things go wrong people assume it defines them permanently. One failed business or one bad investment suddenly becomes evidence that they are not capable, even when in many cases it was timing, environment, or pure randomness rather than ability that caused the outcome. The uncomfortable truth is that you control your effort, your discipline, and your decisions, but you do not control outcomes completely. And that realization is not limiting but freeing, because it forces you to stop over-crediting yourself for wins and stop over-blaming yourself for losses. And instead, the smartest people start building systems that respect uncertainty. They diversify, they keep reserves, they avoid decisions that can destroy them, not because they expect failure, but because they understand that randomness is always part of the game, and the goal is not to win every move but simply to stay in the game long enough for probability to work in your favor. Because if you survive long enough, opportunities appear, timing improves, and small advantages quietly compound until what looks like luck to others is actually the result of persistence plus survival. And for anyone building a business or career, this is a critical shift, because one success does not define you and one failure does not define you either. They are just single moments inside a much longer journey shaped partly by chance, So instead of asking why someone else succeeded and you didn't, a better question becomes whether you have built a system that can survive both luck and risk long enough for success to eventually arrive, because in the long run survival often matters more than brilliance. But this also leads to a deeper question. If success is partly luck and survival matters so much, then how do you know when to stop chasing more before ambition itself becomes the thing that destroys everything you've built? What if the biggest threat to your financial future isn't earning too little money, but never knowing when to stop? Because for many people, wealth doesn't disappear from bad decisions. It disappears from the inability to feel satisfied with good ones. And Morgan Housel highlights a powerful but uncomfortable truth in The Psychology of Money. One of the most underrated financial skills is knowing when you already have enough, yet it's also the one most people never develop because there is no finish line for more. The moment you reach one level of success, another comparison appears. You buy a car and see someone with a better one. You reach 6 figures and suddenly 7 becomes the goal. You reach 7 and 8 appears. And what once felt like success slowly turns into something ordinary again. And this is where even smart people get trapped, not because they don't understand money but because they never clearly define what enough actually looks like for them. So they keep chasing one more deal, one more investment, one more risk, not because they are failing but because they feel like they are still behind. And here's where the danger begins. The higher you climb, the more you often have to risk to go even higher, until eventually the extra upside is no longer worth the potential downside. But people keep pushing anyway because stopping feels like falling behind others. And this is similar to climbing a mountain where reaching the summit is difficult but clear. But trying to go beyond it where no real path exists doesn't make you more successful, it just increases the chance of a fall. Yet money works the same way because there is always a point where additional risk stops improving your life and starts threatening what you've already built. Which is why many of the people who stay wealthy for decades are not the ones taking the biggest risks but the ones who learn how to protect what they already have. They don't gamble stability for ego, they don't upgrade their lifestyle just to match others, and they don't let comparison make financial decisions for them. Instead, they quietly define their own version of enough, and use it as a boundary that protects their choices. And this becomes even more important in entrepreneurship because ambition is powerful but without limits it becomes dangerous. It builds businesses but it can also destroy them when it pushes expansion too fast, risks too high, or decisions made just to feel like progress is happening. And often the biggest damage doesn't come from failure but from overextension during success when everything looks like it's working, so people take even bigger risks until stability quietly disappears. Because the paradox is that people who never feel enough often keep chasing until they lose what they already built, while those who define enough early tend to protect their wealth, reduce unnecessary risk, and stay in control for much longer. And maybe the hardest truth is that at some point more money doesn't reduce stress, it increases responsibility, more decisions, more pressure, more things that can go wrong. Which means the real question shifts from how to make more to how much is actually enough for the life you want and what you might be risking by going beyond it. Because once you define enough, you stop being controlled by comparison, you stop making emotional financial decisions, and you start protecting the life you've already built. But even then, one reality remains unavoidable. No matter how carefully you plan, the future will always be uncertain. Markets will shift, businesses will break, and unexpected events will happen. So the real question becomes how financially successful people survive in a world they can never fully predict, and that is exactly what the next lesson reveals. Have you ever made a perfect plan only to watch it fall apart because of one event you never saw coming, a market crash, a job loss, or a sudden business shift that completely changed everything no matter how smart or prepared you thought you were? That's the uncomfortable truth Morgan Housel keeps repeating in The Psychology of Money. The future is not predictable, and the people who respect that reality are the ones who survive. Yet most people build their financial lives as if tomorrow will behave exactly like today, assuming that if things are going well they will continue, if markets are rising they will always rise, and if business is growing it will keep growing. But history never works like that because it moves in surprises. Crashes happen when confidence is highest. Opportunities appear when no one expects them. And the biggest disruptions are almost never predicted, not because people are careless but because certainty slowly replaces caution over time. And that is why building wealth is not just about making good decisions but about surviving bad ones. Because even the best strategy becomes useless if you don't stay in the game long enough to benefit from it. Think of a ship crossing the ocean where even with advanced navigation the captain still carries life jackets, backup systems, and emergency supplies, not because disaster is expected but because uncertainty is guaranteed. And your financial life works exactly the same way, where an emergency fund is not pessimism but protection. Diversification is not fear but balance. And avoiding unnecessary debt is not limitation but flexibility. Because when uncertainty hits, flexibility becomes more valuable than confidence. Yet many people make the same mistake during good times by slowly removing their safety nets, increasing spending, taking bigger risks, and assuming stability is permanent until one unexpected event doesn't just slow them down but wipes out their ability to recover quickly. And this becomes even more critical in entrepreneurship, where a single policy change, new competitor, shift in customer behavior, or sudden drop in demand can change everything overnight. And in those moments the winners are rarely the most aggressive or the most intelligent but the ones who built enough resilience to survive the shock, because survival itself compounds. Meaning if you stay in the game long enough you eventually reach opportunities that short-term thinkers never see. But if you are eliminated early, even the best ideas become irrelevant. Which is why the real edge is not prediction but resilience. Not trying to avoid every risk but making sure no single event can take you out completely. Because uncertainty is not a rare event, it is the default setting. And once you accept that, the question shifts from how do I avoid every risk to how do I stay in the game no matter what happens. But even then, one deeper truth remains. Two people can survive the same uncertainty, follow similar principles, and still end up with completely different outcomes. So what actually separates those who quietly build lasting wealth from those who don't? It usually comes down not to intelligence, but to behavior, and that is where the final lesson begins. Why do some highly educated people end up broke while others with average knowledge quietly become wealthy? Why do brilliant investors panic during crashes and sell at the worst possible moment? And why do smart entrepreneurs still fail even when they have good ideas and strong plans? And the uncomfortable answer is this. Financial success is not mainly about intelligence, it is about behavior under pressure. Because Morgan Housel makes a simple but powerful argument in The Psychology of Money that money is a soft skill, not a hard science. Meaning it is not about knowing what to do, since most people already know the basics: save money, invest long-term, avoid unnecessary debt, and stay patient. But the real challenge is actually doing it consistently when emotions are working against you. Because in real life knowledge rarely fails, behavior does. And you can see this clearly when two investors have the same portfolio, the same market conditions, and the same information. Yet when the market drops 30%, one panics and sells everything, locking in losses, while the other stays calm, keeps investing, and follows the plan. And nothing about the market changed between them, only their reaction did. But years later, that single emotional decision creates completely different financial outcomes, not because one was smarter but because one was more stable under pressure. And this same pattern repeats in business, where startups rarely fail because the idea was bad but because emotions like fear, impatience, or overconfidence take over decision-making, leading to good ideas being abandoned too early, or working businesses being scaled too aggressively, or panic choices destroying long-term plans. And the hidden problem is that emotions never announce themselves as bad decisions in the moment. They feel completely justified. Which is why the most successful people don't rely on willpower alone but build systems that protect them from emotional reactions. They automate savings, follow rules instead of impulses, and write down long-term plans so they don't rewrite them during moments of fear or excitement. Because discipline is not about being strong all the time but about reducing the number of times you need to be strong. And over time something even more powerful happens as behavior starts shaping identity. Because every time you save instead of spending impulsively, every time you stay patient instead of chasing shortcuts, and every time you choose long-term stability over short-term excitement, you reinforce a version of yourself that naturally thinks differently about money until it becomes your default way of operating. And that is where real wealth begins, not in one big decision but in thousands of small ones that no one sees. Because markets will rise and fall, opportunities will come and disappear, economies will change, but your behavior is the one variable you control every single day. And if you master that, you gain an advantage that intelligence alone cannot match. But even then, there is one final trap that has destroyed more wealth than bad decisions, bad timing, or bad luck combined. And it is not financial at all but psychological, and it often hides inside success itself. Which is why the next lesson reveals how ego quietly becomes the biggest threat to long-term financial freedom. Have you ever bought something not because you needed it, but because you wanted people to notice, or felt behind in life not because your situation changed but because someone online made theirs look better? And if yes, then you've already experienced one of the most expensive forces in money, and it has nothing to do with income, education, or opportunity but something far more dangerous. Ego, because Morgan Housel puts it bluntly in The Psychology of Money that money and ego are a toxic combination. Since the moment money stops being about freedom and starts becoming about approval, you are no longer in control of your financial life. Your need to be seen is. And this is where most people slowly get trapped without even realizing it, as every raise doesn't create more freedom but instead creates a bigger lifestyle. Every salary increase doesn't reduce stress but upgrades expectations. And every milestone doesn't feel like enough but becomes the new minimum, and so the cycle begins. Earn more, spend more, impress more, feel the same or even feel further behind. Because status has no finish line, there will always be someone with a bigger house, faster car, more impressive title, or more polished lifestyle. And if your goal becomes winning that comparison, you will never stop playing and never feel like you've won. Especially when you realize most of the people you are trying to impress are not even paying attention because they are busy trying to impress someone else. Meaning you are spending real money to win imaginary judgment from people who aren't watching. And nowhere is this more dangerous than in entrepreneurship, because success doesn't just increase income, it increases attention. And attention creates pressure to look successful, so the business slowly becomes not just a business but a performance, with expensive offices, luxury cars, and high-end lifestyles that signal success more than they support it, while behind-the-scenes cash that should be building stability is used to maintain image. Growth slows, flexibility disappears, and risk quietly increases until the business becomes more fragile even while it looks more successful from the outside. And some of the strongest founders understood this early, so they stayed relatively invisible, not because they lacked ambition but because they knew a simple truth. Money used for status disappears while money used for assets multiplies. And ego doesn't just affect spending but also decision-making, because once people are seen as successful they feel pressure to keep proving it, to keep being right, to keep growing even when logic says to pause. So they take bigger risks, ignore warning signs, and refuse to admit mistakes, not because they don't see reality but because their identity becomes tied to not losing it. And that is how ego quietly destroys wealth, not through one dramatic failure but through repeated refusal to step back when needed. Because the market doesn't punish intelligence or ambition as much as it punishes overconfidence. And the opposite of ego is not giving up ambition but removing the need for external validation from financial decisions. Being comfortable building quietly while others chase attention. Choosing freedom over applause and independence over approval. Because in the long run the strongest financial position is often the least visible one, the one that doesn't need approval or performance but simply gives you control over your life. And that leads to the final question. If money is not meant for status and not just for accumulation, then what is its real purpose? What is the highest form of wealth itself? And the answer ties every lesson together and completely changes how you define success. After everything we've covered, there is still one question left. Why do we actually chase money? Is it for cars, houses, luxury brands, and status? Or is it something deeper that most people never clearly define? Because Morgan Housel closes The Psychology of Money with a powerful idea. The highest return money can give you is freedom. Not the freedom to buy everything, but the freedom to choose how you spend your time, who you work with, where you live, and what kind of life you actually want to live. And once you understand that, something fundamental shifts, because money stops being the goal and becomes a tool. Yet from the outside many people look successful with high incomes, big lifestyles, and impressive possessions. But inside they are often trapped. They can't take time off, they can't slow down, and they can't make changes easily because their lifestyle depends on constant income. So even though they have money, they don't actually have freedom. While on the other side there are people who may look average but live below their means, avoid unnecessary debt, and consistently invest over time, and slowly something powerful happens. Their money starts producing options. Not just income but options, the option to leave a toxic job, reject bad opportunities, take breaks without panic, and make decisions without desperation, and that ability to act without financial fear is one of the purest forms of wealth. And when you zoom out, every lesson in this book points to this same destination because invisible wealth creates freedom. Compounding builds freedom over time, understanding luck and risk protects freedom. Knowing when enough is enough preserves freedom. Respecting uncertainty stabilizes freedom. Controlling behavior strengthens freedom. And removing ego prevents freedom from being traded for status. Different ideas but the same endpoint, and for anyone building their financial life, especially early on, the real shift is not asking how much can I earn but how much control am I gaining over my life, because every smart financial decision quietly does three things. It buys back time, reduces pressure, and expands options, and over time that control compounds until one day you realize you are no longer making decisions out of necessity but out of choice, and that is where real wealth appears. Not in the size of the paycheck or the things you own but in the ability to live life on your own terms without needing permission from money or people. So as this journey ends, there is one final question worth reflecting on. Are your financial decisions actually increasing your freedom, or are they quietly building a life that looks successful from the outside but feels restricted on the inside? Because the answer to that question doesn't just define your money, it defines your entire future.